My name's Widdows. I'm a PhD student at the Information School at the University of Sheffield. And this is a presentation for submission 9082 for the Data for Policy Conference 2024. The title of this presentation and the related discussion paper is Data-Driven Analysis of Factors Affecting Headline School Performance Measures in England. In this presentation, what I'd like to do is take you through, first of all, the context and motivation for this project, and then some of the headline findings from this study. Then talk you through some of the approaches, so the data that we use, the different methods deployed, and then a more detailed discussion of how we arrived at the findings and then some of the implications and next steps for this work. So the context and motivation, first of all, we've had 32 years of secondary school performance measures in England. They were introduced in the late 1980s, early 90s as part of the Education Reform Act. So we now have teachers and school leaders working in England who their whole career has been built around the influence of school performance measures and league tables. The intended purpose of school performance measures, or SPMs as we refer to them, is to inform parental choice when choosing a school for their children, to inform inspection and the inspection process, to identify underperformance and provide opportunities for intervention where underperformance is recognised, and also for schools themselves to use as part of their school improvement planning. Over their history, they've been subject to numerous critiques and criticisms. And in particular, at the moment, they're under a great deal of scrutiny for a range of reasons, including the run-up to a general election, and also the school accountability system as a whole is under scrutiny following the death of Ruth Perry, primary school head teacher, whose suicide has been associated with her school's grading. So we set out in this piece of work specifically to use empirical data and a wide range of approaches to explore the nature and extent and breadth of the concept of performance as represented by school performance measures. I want to emphasize that word performance, and you'll see why shortly. So what we found, first of all, we found that the 6 headline school performance measures have 4 underlying factors, latent constructs. These are features of the schools which are being represented by the things that we measure, the metrics that we publish as school performance measures. And those features, those aspects of schools are attainment, progress, curriculum, and destinations. We found that 3 out of those are measuring the same, 3 out of the 6 headline school performance measures, rather, are measuring exactly the same factor. They're measuring attainment. As well as wanting to conceptualize the factors that represented the school performance measures, we wanted to find factors and conceptualize factors which represented wider features of schools that are not just related to performance. And we categorize those as character and context. And we found that school performance measures don't simply represent school performance, they also are shaped by the character of the school and the context of a school, which in our definition means the features of the student intake for the school. So those are features which are not performance related, which are shaping performance measures. And in particular, attainment that factor, which is very, very strongly prioritized in terms of 3 metrics representing it within the 6. Attainment is particularly strongly influenced by those factors which are not performance related, which is character and context. And finally, we found that the use of digital technologies, for example, in this case, cluster analysis, can provide us with some insight into maybe the specific challenges facing different types of schools and their contexts with regard to school performance measures. The data that we used for this study was downloaded, it's publicly available from the Compare the Performance of Schools and Colleges in England website from the UK government. And it includes just over 3,000 mainstream state secondary schools in England. And we used the data for 2021-2022. From that data, we selected 13 variables, the 6 headline performance measures as published by the Department for Education. And that's those 6 listed there. And also 7 wider metrics of wider school information that are commonly used to characterize the particular context in which schools are working, which relate to things like prior attainment as represented by the Key Stage 2 average point score, the percentage of students with free school meals that have received free school meals in the last 6 years as a measure of disadvantage, of economic disadvantage, percentage of English as an additional language, percentage of students, SEN, example. So the methods that we used in this, there are 5 of them. We used exploratory factor analysis first to find the number of underlying factors and to seek to conceptualize those. We then used that as a basis for confirmatory factor analysis, and we used theory in there as well to shape some of the building blocks that we would use later in structural equation modeling. The confirmatory factor analysis allowed us to test and confirm some of the underlying patterns that were starting to emerge from the exploratory factor analysis. It was in the structural equation modeling that we developed more complex models based on theory and using the building blocks that emerge from the CFA as a basis. And we've evaluated those models and iteratively refined them to gain greater insight into those underlying patterns. We then used correlation analysis to explore the associations between the 6 headline measures. In particular, we were interested in the associations between the 3 that had already been identified as representing attainment. And then we used cluster analysis, in particular hierarchical cluster analysis, to further explore the patterns within the school information metrics and how they might influence the school performance metrics. So the EFA, the exploratory factor analysis, we've got this diagram represents our findings from the EFA. We found that there were 3, potentially actually 4 factors which are represented in the 6 headline measures which are listed there on the left. The 3 or 4 factors which are represented there are attainment, as represented by Attainment 8 Basics and EBAC average point score. Destinations, which is represented by the destinations measure, that's what it's called. It's a measure of the percentage of students that go on to meaningful education and training on employment beyond their time in mainstream schools at the age of 16. We've then got progress, as represented by Progress 8, and the shape of the curriculum in terms of the percentage of students that follow what's called the EBAC, which is a group, a very specific group of government recognised academic qualifications. We used the findings of the EFA then to begin to shape the building blocks for later work. So we explored the things like just the overall picture of performance as represented by the 6 headline measures. That's what we've got here. And you can see that while we have some metrics with very high factor loadings, we've got others with relatively lower factor loadings. The high factor loadings you can see here And those are in those metrics which, again, were associated with attainment earlier. So we could refine this model further to, rather than calling it performance, we could call it attainment. We can see there that destinations has got a relatively lower factor loading, it's 0.63. Destinations is a complex measure, and it adds an additional noise in relation to the other metrics, partly because it represents the previous year's cohort. So while for attainment there, for example, attainment 8 basics and year back average point score were represented by the exam results of students in 2022. The destinations is actually measuring the destinations of students that left in 2021. So unsurprisingly, it could be argued there's a degree of noise introduced into that particular metric, and that's why then when we wanted to clarify exactly that that factor, we've defined attainment as being represented by those 3 metrics, and we use this same process for other features of schools, for the wider school information metrics, for context, for example, which are represented by prior attainment, that's Key Stage 2 average point score, deprivation, that's free school meals in the last 6 years, percentage of English as an additional language, and percentage of students with SEN. We found that the metrics there with relatively low factor loadings were percentage EAL and percentage SEN. There's a number of arguments for that, which we discuss in the discussion paper for this. But again, because they had a relatively low factor loading, we lost them from the conceptualization of this particular factor, and therefore context was represented by prior attainment, Key Stage 2 average point score, and disadvantage, that's free school meals ever 6. And we did the same thing for school character. Here, the lowest factor loading was for religious character, so we lost that to define school character factor as being represented by the metrics of school single gender and selective. So these then became our building blocks for later, more complex models. And these are the other metrics. Progress 8 represented a factor of progress. Percentage E-back entry is representing curriculum, and destinations representing the destination of students. These 6 factors represented by these ellipses, each are represented by other metrics, which are represented by the boxes, the rectangles. So it allowed us then within structural equation modeling to develop much more complex models to explore the relationships between factors and metrics. Now, while this might look a little bit daunting and over complex, I just want to emphasize that this part of this diagram is school character represented by single gender and selective metrics. And this is the building block that I've just shown you. And similarly, context here in the center is that building block which we started with. And the same is true for the other factors on there as represented by the ellipses. So what we wanted to do was start with a model which looked at the associations between each of those factors with each other, but then wanted to refine this. So we used a number of different model fit indices, and again, you can find out more detail of this in the associated discussion paper. But this suggested not a great model fit for this, but that's unsurprising, you could argue, because we've got some associations there, some regressions which have very, very low factor loadings. So we removed those regressions, for example, between school character and attainment, school character and curriculum, school character and progress, and refined the model, and then re-evaluated it using the same factor metric, the same fit metrics. What we wanted to do with the fit metrics is we didn't have a particular threshold we wanted to cross as such. We wanted to measure progress towards a better fit and a more parsimonious model which fit with the theory. So we were using those fit metrics as those model fit metrics as a way of evaluating the changes that we made to the model and whether we'd improved the model or made it worse. By doing that, following that process, we arrived at some models which are simpler, fit neatly with the theory, and can be explained using the theory, but also provide some insight. So here we have our final model for all that includes all 6 headline school performance metrics. And what we can see here, we've got school character as shaping and having an influence on school context. We then have school context. That's the intake of a school. So it's not the performance of a school. It's not the effectiveness of the school. It's the context in which it's working and the student body in which the teachers are working with. That's shaping to some extent all 6 of the school performance metrics. So there's a significant finding there that school performance measures are not just measuring performance. They're also measuring school context and school character. In particular, what we found there is that we had a much better model fit. And if we then refine that model even further and just focused in particular on those metrics which are measuring attainment, which, as I said, appear to have sort of priority within the school performance measures because 3 out of the 6 headline measures are measuring that same factor of attainment. Those have a particularly strong association with context and character. So we have a situation where we've got 6 headline school performance measures. 3 of those are measuring attainment, and those 3 are very strongly influenced by the context in which a school works and the school's character. This is not just a measure of school performance. And the model fits for that particular model were very good. We then turned to correlation analysis, and then we looked at the correlations between all of the metrics, but we were particularly interested in the strength of the correlation between those 3 metrics associated with attainment. That's attainment rate, EBAC average point score, and the percentage of students gaining a grade 5 or above in English and maths. That's called the basics measure. It's not just the fact that these are correlated, they're so strongly correlated, they're measuring the same thing. In itself, that may be seen to be an issue, a problem. In the emphasis it places on attainment, which has been criticised and over a long period of time with other, when we've had times with other metrics, which have been measures of attainment, because it's not been seen as being fair to schools with different intakes, maybe with lower prior attainment or higher levels of disadvantage. But it's the strength of the correlation here, which means that potentially there's an opportunity, rather than sticking with 3 metrics all measuring the same thing, we could lose 2 of those, replace them with something that adds breadth into the school performance measures and still be reflecting the same features of schools. Just to run quickly through the cluster analysis then, which we did, which is the final approach we used. We used agglomerative hierarchical clustering, and we formed 4 clusters in line with the indications from parallel scree plots and silhouette width plots. You can see those 4 clusters are not all the same size. We've got 2 large clusters. That's cluster 1 and 2, and 2 smaller ones, clusters 3 and 4. What was significant here was the features of those clusters. Remember, these clusters have been formed using the wider school information metrics. Those are what we used in this. We didn't form these clusters based on the school performance metrics. We based it on the 7 characteristics of schools, the 7 features of schools described as wider school information. But what we found there was that cluster 1 had high levels of percentage of the students with disadvantage, low prior attainment, slightly below average English as an additional language, high levels of SEN, and on average and in general, those schools were below average for all 6 school performance measures. So it appears that there are features, the features of those schools which form that cluster, which come from the wider school information. That's those metrics that are related to school context and school character, that those somehow shape the school performance measures. And for the schools in cluster 1, it appears that they are somehow disadvantaged because of the context and character of the schools with regard to school performance measures. The other side of that is that cluster 2, that we've got schools there with below average disadvantage, above average prior attainment, lower than average percentage SEN. Again, what we seem to have here is a group of schools that have some sort of advantage in terms of the school performance measures, and that's rings true when we see that on average, in general, those schools are above average for all 6 school performance measures. We'll come back to cluster 3 in a second. Cluster 4 is pretty much all grammar schools. Of the 163 schools in that cluster, 161 are grammar schools. They're almost all selective schools. They have very low percentage of students classed as disadvantaged, very high prior attainment, very low SEN. They're also much more likely to be single gender, about 71% are single gender, and much more likely to have a religious character. Those schools are significantly above average for all 6 metrics of the school performance metrics. And then cluster 3, we've got a more complex picture. We've got schools there with, in general, above average disadvantage and below average prior attainment, which we might consider to be disadvantages with regard to school performance metrics. And then we've got, but those schools also, in general, have very high percentage EAL, English as an additional language, and very low percentage of SEN. And the interaction of each of these metrics together means that we end up with a kind of complex picture with regard to the school performance measures. They're above average for 4 of the metrics and below average for the remaining 2. Implications of this study then. First of all, we've identified dominance of attainment in the school performance measures, and that has significant implications for their use. It has implications for the use by parents in making choice of schools for inspection, intervention, school improvement planning, because it's prioritising attainment rather than progress or curriculum or destinations or any other measures of school performance within those particular headline measures. That's going to be even more dominant when we don't have progress aid in 2025 and 2026, so that 3 out of the 5 headline school performance measures will represent attainment. That can be seen to be an opportunity to replace 2 of those. So we've got three measures measuring the same thing. We could replace 2 of those and add greater breadth into school performance measures. We've also identified that school character and context, and I'll emphasize again, that those are factors that are not related to school effectiveness. They're not related to school performance. They have an influence on school performance measures. And that has important implications both for their design going forward and for their interpretation. And one suggestion might be that we call them school performance measures, but maybe they should just be called school measures. They're measuring something about schools, but they're not just measuring performance and shouldn't be considered to be doing so. And finally, we've shown that all of the digital analytical approaches that we've used, with the addition of cluster analysis, will allow us to identify and quantify the challenges that schools face based on their character and context with regard to school performance measures. And that has a potential to inform policy around the support that schools need to overcome those challenges. The next steps for this work will be not just to use the relatively restricted data set which is publicly available, but to use larger data sets, for example, the National Pupil Database and the School Workforce Census, to use a wider range of richer variables related to school information and school performance, which is also aggregated at a student level rather than just a school level. We'll develop those structural equation models using potentially subsets of the data, looking at schools with, for example, with similar inspection gradings or similar governance arrangements, or schools within geographical regions, and we'll use those with those larger data sets. And we'll use and evaluate alternative clustering approaches to further develop that idea of the use of such approaches in informing the design of school performance measures and related policy to school performance measures. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments on any of this work, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at the address on the screen. Thank you.